How much RAM do you need in modern games? If you look at their recommended system requirements, most of them suggest 16GB is enough. But is it really as simple as that? If you have 16GB or even 32GB already, should you be considering an upgrade? Or would that money be better spent elsewhere? Of all the things you can upgrade in a PC, memory is probably the cheapest and easiest to do, but how much benefit you'll get from the extra memory depends on a few factors. Firstly, the games you play can make a difference. If you prefer heavy simulation titles, or do a lot of modding, or run your own server, then you'll need more memory simply by default. If you run a lot of programs simultaneously, or use your PC for more than just gaming, then again, you might find that more RAM helps. But outside of those specific circumstances, can the average gamer expect more performance from adding more memory? While that might seem like a simple enough question to answer, I am who I am, and I had to go and overcomplicate things. I've come up with 3 different questions, and to answer them I've run a bunch of games through a bunch of tests. These games are all fairly recent, from a mix of different genres, and most of them pop up somewhere in the Steam Most Played list, or have simply had good reviews. My test system for this project comes courtesy of Scan Computers UK, who reached out to see if they could send anything to help with the video. Up until the 7th of July 2024, they're running a promotion on a range of all AMD bundles, featuring AM4 and AM5 motherboards, matching Ryzen CPUs and Radeon RX 7000 series graphics cards. AMD's Ryzen 7000 CPUs are some of the best options for performance, value and efficiency for both gamers and creators alike. The current range of AM5 socket motherboards are looking to be compatible with future CPU launches through till at least 2027. Plus, not only do the Radeon RX 7000 series graphics cards offer great value for money, they also offer features like FSR frame generation, AV1 encoding and Radeon anti-lag. And, if that wasn't enough, select Radeon GPUs currently come with up to 2 free games, from a choice of Starfield, Company of Heroes 3, Lies of P, and Avatar Frontiers of Pandora. Yes, I got the name right, that's how serious I am right now. So, if you're in the UK and looking for a great deal on a PC setup, check out the links in the description. The bundle scan provided for this video consists of the Asus ROG Strix X670EF gaming motherboard, Ryzen 9 7900X3D CPU, and Sapphire Pulse Radeon RX 7900 XT graphics card. The memory itself is DDR5, and I'm using 3 different kits. 1 pair of Hynix 8GB sticks, 1 pair of Corsair Vengeance 16s, and another pair of Vengeance 32s. Memory usually performs best in pairs, though some people buy single sticks to save money now but leave room to upgrade later, so I've also tested single 16 and 32GB sticks as well. I've limited the clock speeds of the various kits to 4800 to make sure the test is fair, but it's also not completely realistic. 16 and 32GB sticks of DDR4 are available in higher clock speeds than 8GB sticks are, and memory speed can have a big effect on performance. Possibly bigger than RAM capacity, but that's a subject for another video. Starfield's New Atlantis seemed like as good a place as any to start. This is one of the most punishing parts of an already demanding game, featuring a fairly large number of NPCs. We know this area is hard on CPUs and GPUs, but does RAM quantity have an effect on performance? Well, a pair of 8GB sticks achieves an average of 84 frames per second, with the occasional stutter while loading in data that causes frames to briefly drop as low as 29. Swapping them out for a pair of 16GB sticks has almost no appreciable impact. The average climbs a couple of frames, and the lows gain about 10%, but probably not enough to make you glad you bought the extra RAM. However, if you started with only a single 16GB stick, you might notice a bigger increase. The average in that case is only 78 FPS, and while the 0.1% lows appear unaffected, the 1% lows are a bit lower. The Last of Us is known for being particularly hungry for VRAM, But does it benefit from regular system RAM? Actually, yes, though you might not notice at first. The average frame rate is virtually unchanged. At 1440 Ultra with FSR quality upscaling, both the dual-stick setups score about the same average of 123 to 126 FPS. Even 1% lows remain similar, but the 0.1% lows, which represent the most severe stutters in gameplay, are significantly better with 32GB. The difference from a single 16GB stick to a pair is much more noticeable, however. There are even more small stutters in gameplay than the pair of 8GB produced, and the average was about 10% lower than the 32GB results. When it comes to graphically beautiful, technically impressive games, Alan Wake 2 is pretty high on the list. It's also notoriously hard to run, but mostly due to its GPU demands. It turns out, Alan Wake 2 doesn't use all that much system memory, and that makes sense. It has relatively small maps and linear scripted gameplay, so it doesn't need to store a ton of assets in memory in case they're needed. As such, there really isn't much difference between the dual-stick configurations. Both 16 and 32GB kits produce roughly the same average and low frame rates. The single stick is, as we've come to expect, a bit slower. The narrower bandwidth has a small negative impact on both averages and minimum frame rates, but only to the tune of about 6 to 7%. Baldur's Gate 3 is still one of the most popular single-player games on Steam right now, and it's also one that's particularly at home on PC. As an RPG with point-and-click navigation and hybrid turn-based gameplay, it's not as sensitive to frame rates as, say, a first-person shooter, and it can be pretty demanding on PC hardware. I loaded up a save in the city of Baldur's Gate that I downloaded from Nexus Mods, as I haven't got that far in the gameplay myself, and I'd heard that this is one of the heaviest parts of the game to run. Sure enough, the average frame rate could be in the 80s and 90s elsewhere in the game, but falls to under 70 in the city, and 1% lows are in the 30s. It seems like the game's only utilising 4 to 5GB of system RAM even here, and upgrading from a dual-stick 16GB kit to a dual-stick 32GB adds less than 10%. The margin from the single-stick kit is much bigger, with the extra bandwidth resulting in an increase of 10 FPS. I wanted to test Microsoft Flight Simulator because, as I mentioned earlier, Sims can be quite demanding on memory. Or at least, that's what I've heard. In reality, at least in my test, the data in the corner suggests the Sim is allocating around 11 to 12GB of RAM and utilising just 6 to 7GB of it. And this is roughly the same in both the 16 and 32GB tests. My usual benchmark run is flying over Manhattan in a Cessna, and while I would assume that the location alone would eat up a lot of RAM, I wondered if maybe my choice of aircraft was a bit too simple for this test, so I tried loading up something a bit more complicated. I couldn't completely replicate my flight plan in an Airbus A320, but I gave it a stab, and although the frame rate did indeed drop to about 31 FPS, this doesn't seem to be on accord of the RAM, which, despite the vastly more detailed model, is, if anything, being used less than before. I also included a couple of more popular competitive online games, first of which is Call of Duty Warzone. I chose this game in particular because I've heard commenters say it's especially demanding on memory. However, I don't really see it. Warzone is allocating 12GB or more on the 16GB setup, and when it has more physical RAM to hand, it will allocate even more. However, regardless of how much is allocated, only about 8 to 9GB is actually being used. It's hard to do true, meaningful comparative benchmarks in this game due to how wide the game world is and the random nature of gameplay, but it certainly seems like average FPS is virtually unaffected by upgrading from 16 to 32GB. The single 16GB stick is about 5 to 10% slower, as we've come to expect, so once more it seems like memory bandwidth is more important than memory quantity. Finally, I don't really expect Counter-Strike 2 to care all that much about RAM. It's a notoriously CPU-intensive game, but it's also a competitive shooter, so its more hardcore fans will take every advantage they can get. And, sure enough, there's actually a small advantage to having 32GB. Granted, I don't think anyone would really notice the difference between 255 and 265 average FPS, but it looks like the larger memory pool also comes with better 1% lows, and this could be noticeable to a more discerning player. The single 16GB stick, for once, doesn't seem all that different from the dual stick kit, so casual players don't need to worry about losing out if they can only get a single 16GB stick. To answer the question of whether you need to upgrade from 16 to 32GB is a bit tougher than a simple yes or no. If you're intending on adding a second 16GB stick to an existing one, then absolutely, it can have a large effect on performance to do so. If you already have two 8GB sticks, which isn't that realistic in a DDR5 system, but in a DDR4 one it's actually pretty common, swapping it out for a pair of 16GB sticks might not offer any performance improvement at all. And while I'm not saying you shouldn't upgrade your RAM, you should probably prioritise higher clocks and lower latencies, as they could have a measurable benefit that simply adding more gigabytes won't. Oh, and I did crunch the numbers on a single 32GB stick, and the same things apply as the single 16GB stick. So swapping a pair of 8GB for a single 32 could actually mean a drop in performance. Some of you are thinking to yourself, okay, Iceberg, if that is your real name, aren't you testing in ideal conditions? What about real-world testing? Yes, it's true. My name isn't really Iceberg, and yes, I closed all non-essential programs before testing. In the real world, things are messier. People leave apps and windows open in the background. I'm not necessarily talking about niche use cases like streaming either. Just having a few web browser tabs open can use some of your RAM, and while Windows does a pretty good job of managing memory, it could still potentially have an impact. So here are those games again, this time with 5 Chrome tabs open, as well as the Epic, Steam and Battle.net launchers. These apps alone use more than 8GB of RAM, so how much does this affect gaming? In Starfield, not at all. If you're running a full-on app on a second monitor, maybe OBS or something, perhaps it will affect the game's performance, but if you just forgot to close down all your windows and apps before launching the game, you shouldn't notice any loss of performance. The Last of Us shows some loss with 16GB of RAM to the tune of about 3%. With 32GB that mostly vanishes, though the 0.1% lows are slightly worse with the background apps open than without. Alan Wake 2 only sees the very smallest differences, which can probably be accounted for by simple run-to-run variances in how I moved the camera or the character. Baldur's Gate 3 is also virtually unaffected by the extra apps, but in fairness, with only 4 to 5GB being used by the game, Windows doesn't need to manage the memory all that hard. Microsoft Flight Simulator is the title I expected to struggle the most, and yet it too has no problem at all with all the extra background apps. Warzone, unfortunately, wasn't very consistent. Each of these scenarios represents around 15 minutes of total gameplay, averaged out over various different parts of the map, so it's pretty frustrating that the data isn't more useful, but it certainly leads me to think there's not much harm in leaving apps open in the background. Finally, CS2 also shows some variability in the results. With 16GB installed, the difference is negligible, yet with 32GB, there's actually a slightly bigger benefit to closing everything in the background. In truth, this is probably as much down to the inherently random nature of gameplay as anything. To answer the second question, I don't think you need to worry too much about pruning your background tasks before gaming. Sure, if you're going into something competitive, it's probably good form to get used to quitting out of stuff you're not using, but for the most part, it won't be the end of the world. I did plan on following up this video with one on 64GB of RAM, but the results were complicated somewhat when I couldn't get my Corsair Vengeance kit of 5600 CL40 to run at 4800 CL32. The best I could manage was CL38, so there's a small difference in latency between the results from the 64GB kit and the others. There's also precious little benefit from the extra RAM, so quite a lot of the benchmarks are actually worse than the 32GB ones. Starfield sees literally no improvement from the 64GB kit, though thankfully the higher cache latency doesn't have much of a negative impact either, only within a frame lower than the 32GB kits. The Last of Us enjoyed a very small improvement to 0.1% lows, meaning ever so slightly smoother gameplay, in theory. In practice, you'd never notice. Alan Wake 2's frame rates are scarcely any different from the 64GB run to either of the previous tests, though for whatever reason the 16GB kit had slightly lower 0.1% lows. Baldur's Gate 3 actually lost the performance gained in the 32GB test, which suggests the higher cache latency might have hurt performance. And on the flip side of that, there may be some room for improvement with lower latency, higher capacity memory sticks. And the exact same can be said of Flight Simulator, whose performance gains from the 32GB kit are undone by the 64GB kits. If there's enough interest, I might have to revisit these titles with some higher quality memory to see how high we can go with lower latencies and higher clocks. Meanwhile, Warzone sees virtually no appreciable difference stepping up to 64GB, and doesn't seem to mind the drop in latency much either. Or, I don't know, maybe they cancelled each other out. Finally, CS2 loses performance in the percentile lows, probably due to the higher latency RAM. So, to answer the third question, 64GB could be great for your coding applications or your large Photoshop or Illustrator documents, your video editing software or your server, but your gaming PC doesn't really need it, and if it means dropping clock speeds or increasing latency, it could actually have the opposite effect. Okay, so if you just wanted answers about RAM, then the video's over. Thanks for watching. Check out the Scan UK links if you're interested in getting a good bundle deal. But before I go, I wanted to talk about the one game that didn't make it to the benchmarks, that I was pretty much forced to leave on the cutting room floor. After my last memory test video in 2022, I'd been recommended to try out Cities Skylines, and as I'd somehow ended up with a copy in my Epic Games library, I gave it a shot. I haven't played a city builder properly since the 1990s, but I figured I'd just download someone's pre-made city and use that for testing. It turns out I was a bit naive, as you actually need to spend quite a lot of money on DLC to even load most of the cities out there on the internet, and I simply didn't have time to learn how to play and build my own. When it came time to make this video in 2024, Cities Skylines 2 was now a thing, and it was available on Xbox Game Pass. There's a 1 million population city uploaded to Nexus Mods, I'll leave a link in the description, and it doesn't have any special prerequisites, so I tried it out. Only to see, well, this. This is at 1440 high without any upscaling, but you can see the GPU barely gets a word in edgeways. The average FPS is about 20. Lows are in the single digits, and frame times look like my city's going through an earthquake. Dropping quality far enough does have some bearing on the average FPS, but it doesn't fix the frame time issue. Adding RAM doesn't help either. The average appears to climb a little as the amount of memory increases, but the percentile lows are basically unchanged, and the game is just as much of a mess even with 64 gigs on board. I remember hearing some complaints when the game launched, and at the time it seemed like every game out there was terribly optimised. But that was ages ago, and I thought maybe they'd have had time to fix it by now. If they have, then I shudder to think what kind of state City Skylines 2 was in at launch. Anyway, that really is the end of the video. Kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.